Hello, my name is Laura Keel from SPED 509, and I'm here to do my presentation on Fragile X syndrome. The definition for Fragile X syndrome is that it's a genetic disorder. FXS is caused by changes in the Fragile X protein FMR1. FMR1 gene is needed for normal brain development, and people with Fragile X do not typically make this protein. Description of Fragile X is that it's a genetic condition that is a linked mutation to the X chromosome. Males experience more severe symptoms than females, and there are physical and intellectual symptoms, and there is no known cure. Although there are treatment services, and there's discussion about use of medication in order to assist with behavior problems. The prevalence and incidence with Fragile X is the prevalence is males there's 1 in 250 to 800 population, females there's 1 in 130 to 250 population. And the incidence is that there's 1 in 4,000 males will be affected and 1 in 8,000 females will be affected. Now I'm going to go over all the impacts in the different areas that were outlined. For cognitive development, the majority of males demonstrate intellectual disabilities. But the cognitive impacts can range from moderate learning disabilities to severe intellectual disabilities. There's a wide range for females and males, but the majority of males demonstrated more on that end of the spectrum with intellectual disabilities rather than the moderate learning disabilities. Physical development, people with Fragile X typically have enlarged ears, an enlarged face, which is more of a larger forehead, and enlarged chest. Enlarged ears can cause ear infections, and some other physical impacts are that they could have flat or arched feet, or that they could be double or hyper jointed. For social development, many people with Fragile X syndrome have social anxiety. In the research, there's also been notices that they may have general anxiety, but most times they find that it is social anxiety, so anxiety that's caused by social situations. For behavioral development, individuals with Fragile X typically have ADD or ADHD, which is when the medication kind of comes into play, or there's a lot of educational strategies to help with the attention of these students in school. They may also have a sensory disorder, or they are at a higher risk for aggression. For communication, individuals with Fragile X syndrome may have phonological difficulties, conversational speech difficulty, oral motor difficulties, syntax or semantic difficulties, or potential hearing difficulties. Some educational impacts and consideration. In early childhood, all of the research kind of points to that people with Fragile X syndrome have a positive response to early intervention. So the sooner that children are diagnosed and can receive intervention, the more positive outcomes that they can receive. We also need to be in a structured environment with exposure to peers that can model skills and behavior. Throughout all of my research on educational impacts, it says at every level that there should somehow be same-age peer interaction, whether that's full inclusion or specials or some kind of interaction with peers that are the same age as them. In elementary school, they really need to focus on attending behaviors since a large majority of people with Fragile X have ADD or ADHD. There also needs to be specific and structured speech and language interventions to help with all those communication difficulties. In middle school, schools need to work on higher clarity and precision in oral and social communication. They need to continue to focus on inclusion if possible, and then this is where they need to start including the student in the transitional planning for high school and after high school. In high school, there needs to be a main focus on employment, social adaptability, and self-determination, and there's a big emphasis on doing community-based instruction, so all that social anxiety piece and the attention piece can be addressed. They can have a direct instruction on those social skills and the community skills that they need out in the community. Some educational adaptations. Many of the early childhood and elementary school adaptations talk about pairing a sound with syllables so that it's easier to kind of recall. You have that visual with the sound. Using concrete manipulatives in math, using visual cues, kind of repetition with any kind of schedule or when you're working on a specific skill to help retain and recall the information for that student. And also to incorporate appropriate pacing. This students with Fragile X syndrome could be included with their peers, but that the information they receive could be differentiated and in a more appropriate pace for them than their general education peers. Some social adaptations is a community-based approach and to directly teach social skills with that intervention with social work or whatever kind of counseling that student is receiving. For self-determination adaptations, you should provide opportunities to be with same-age peers as much as possible. You should include students in their transition and high school IEP meetings so that they can voice their opinion on maybe classes that they want to take or strengths or deficits that they feel like they want to work on. For behavioral and emotional adaptations, students with Fragile X should be in a structured environment with low distractions. We need to prepare students for transition, whether that's using timers or kind of those visual or gestural cues in instruction, and also to use a multisensory approach to learning. For communication, a lot of communication adaptations were for writing for people with Fragile X syndrome, so that might be providing computer-based interventions for writing or providing them an alternative means to answering written responses. The family impact mainly had to do with after they learned their child was diagnosed with Fragile X. So they kind of felt like they faced a lack of support and needed services. They were concerned that the physician's knowledge of the syndrome was minimal and that they weren't learning as much as they could or they didn't understand, or that they had a lack of support to maneuver through referrals, and that they were also concerned with waiting lists for services for their child. These are all the references that I used throughout the presentation. Please feel free to ask any questions that you may have or provide any comments. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.